Thank you very much indeed, and it's great to see so many of you waiting until the very end for my turn here. I opened it last year on the Friday evening, so it's very exciting for me to close this wonderful festival tonight. I normally do this show that I call Rock and Roll Politics, a one-man show. I do it at the Edinburgh Festival and elsewhere. And I call it Rock and Roll Politics for three reasons. One, it is a metaphor for British politics at the moment. It's all shook up. This festival has reflected it. The referendum in Scotland, a possible referendum in Europe, a coalition at Westminster. We're not used to that. So it is a kind of metaphor for politics. I also call it rock and roll politics as a marketing device to get a young audience in on the assumption that I'm going to perform rock and roll for an hour. Look at the audience today. I'm going to have to work on that one. No. Actually, you look really young. And third, I call it rock and roll politics purely as a rather pathetic, I'm a journalist. What am I doing? It's a kind of fantasy of mine. But here in the programme, I notice, it's not called that. It's called the State of the Union Address. So I feel sort of oddly elevated from a pathetic journalist having a middle-age crisis going on stage to be kind of like the President of the United States. I'm giving you a State of the Union Address. So I'm very honoured to have that title. And what we're going to do, if it's okay with you, in the time we've got, is going to be quite short. It's going to rush by because we've got to get out of this place. We're going to look at the referendum, and then I thought we could look at the British general election, and then we can follow kind of some of the themes which really interest me about politics, the kind of dilemmas politicians face that make them politics so inherently interesting at all times. I'm sort of one of the few journalists who are pro-politics, which puts me in a very unpopular position quite often. But let's find out a bit more about all of us here for the final session today. Could I, first of all, in terms of all of you, how many of you are from Scotland, please? Right, I don't know if any of you listen to any questions on Radio 4, but Jonathan Dimbleby always does this. And I think he lies, because none of us can see the audience. And so Jonathan Dimbleby would say, a small minority from Scotland. How many from England, please? Okay. How many from outside the United Kingdom? Right. What a complicated audience this is going to be. Okay, well, for those outside the United Kingdom, I will be making references to people who you probably have absolutely no knowledge of whatsoever, but I will try and explain who they are as we go along. And also, let me just to set the scene, I'm not going to ask you, you've had the kind of referendum debate chaired by Jim Nocherty, but just to get a sense of where we are vis-a-vis the referendum. And you can all have a vote in here. I know in Scotland it's only you who have a vote. I'm just going to ask you this, not what you want to happen, but what you think will happen in the referendum. And as I say, you all have a vote, whether you're from Scotland or America or wherever. How many of you think Scotland will vote yes next month? A majority will vote yes. Right, Jonathan Dimbleby, that's the overwhelming majority in the tent. How many of you think Scotland will vote no? Predict, not what, Tiny minority of you. No, that's the majority. Okay, so that's interesting. You think a majority of you that Scotland will vote to stay in the United Kingdom. In a minute, I'll talk through what I think is one of the sort of weird things about referendums. The vast majority of you are from Scotland, so I'm not going to talk to you about what you've been experiencing from the last year. There's nothing more annoying than someone from London talking about that. But I will be developing what I think is such a weird thing about referendums. We have a weird relationship about referendums. We, as in the UK, they both change everything and change nothing. And as I do, if it's okay, I'm going to present you with a couple of dilemmas that various politicians will face in that context. And I just want to talk, before we get onto the referendum, about dilemmas. Actually, the sessions here have reflected the various dilemmas many politicians face at the moment. But I follow this with great interest because columnists in Britain, I don't know what it's like in America and the other countries represented here, always say to politicians, do this, do that, weak, bold. We speak in complete cliches without recognizing the complexities of what they face. I was struck with this with Ed Miliband the other day, or the other month. Ed Miliband, for those of you from elsewhere, is leader of the opposition, leader of the Labour Party here. And he was slaughtered in the English media. I don't know whether it reached Scotland. I suspect it did. Do you remember this? Just before the World Cup, Miliband was photographed with the Sun newspaper. Do you remember this? Backing the England team. And Miliband was slaughtered because the Sun is deeply unpopular for good reasons in Liverpool and elsewhere. And Miliband would have been conscious of this when he was photographed. And Miliband, not being one of life's actors as a politician, couldn't hide his discomfort as he had the Sun in front of him. So he did this photo. And he looked ridiculous. And he was slaughtered. And the columnist said, this is a sign of weakness. Miliband is unprincipled. How dare he hold the Sun? But the Sun photo was backing the England football team. Now that is always a doomed cause. However, imagine if he hadn't been, had refused to take that photo and said to the Sun, oh, I'm not going to be photographed backing the England team. He would have been slaughtered. Every single columnist who slaughtered him for being photographed with the Sun would have been slaughtering him for other reasons if he hadn't done that photo. This North London intellectual geek won't back our boys before the start of the World Cup. He would have been destroyed. And that's a classic example of the dilemmas that make politics so compelling and difficult and tragic and farcical. Because there's no doubt at all, I'll let you into this, that Ed Miliband, for those of you abroad, possibly the next Prime Minister, if the polls are correct, he'll be winning the election next year. He was reduced to misery by the reaction of that, because the one thing he clings to is this idea that he's got principles. He's quite sort of courageous in his own mind. And to be slaughtered for being unprincipled really affected him. And he had a crisis this summer. It was a crisis fueled by the Sun newspaper controversy and the fact that he was photographed eating a bacon sandwich badly. Do you remember? I don't know how you eat a bacon sandwich well, but if those of you from the UK will remember that during the European election campaign, one of the huge issues was whether Ed Miliband could be Prime Minister because he was filmed eating a bacon sandwich badly. And sure, if you look at the photos, he did look a bit odd, but I mean, is this the criteria to elect a Prime Minister? However, such was the level of personal disarray, actually, when you're being slaughtered for the Sun thing, slaughtered for not eating a bacon sandwich. Miliband decided to make an extraordinary speech. Some of you will recollect this. It was at the start of the summer holidays. And he calls it privately his bacon sandwich speech, where basically, in a room like this, quite a small, intimate room, he gave a speech saying basically he was useless. He said, look, I can't eat a bacon sandwich. If you want a Prime Minister who can eat a bacon sandwich, don't vote for me. And it became like something out of, for those of you who know Monty Python, a Monty Python sketch. It began with a bacon sandwich, but by the end of the speech, he was sort of saying, look, if you want someone who can add up, don't vote for me. If you want someone who can give you economic recovery, don't vote for me. And you thought, my God, what am I listening to here? And as I sat there, I was deeply uncomfortable. And I thought it was a mistake. But in a curious way, he felt purged by this speech. It was a cathartic moment. And he thinks that when he's attacked next for a bacon sandwich crisis, he can cite that speech. And I don't know whether he's right or wrong. And frankly, he doesn't know whether he's right or wrong. And that's one of the great dilemmas of politics. And if it's okay with you, if we've got time, I'm going to get you into the mind of a couple of politicians and the dilemmas they currently face. And I'll ask you what you would do if you were them. But beforehand, let's get on to the referendum. Now, as I said at the very beginning, most of you will know much more about it than me, and I'm not going to attempt to lecture you on what you've all experienced. It would be absurd and rude and probably not very helpful to any of us. But I did watch the referendum debate between Salmond and Darling. How many of you watched the referendum debate? Quite a lot of you. It was really funny. We were on holiday in Umbria and watched the STV feed perfectly. But on Twitter, all these English people were complaining they couldn't see it. It was really interesting. Umbria, perfect reception, which, as all the British columnists were in Umbria at the time, was very convenient. And as always, sorry? You're kidding. You couldn't even see it in the borders. Should have been in Umbria. Perfect reception. At Tuscany, it was pretty good as well, and Polly Toynbee was in Tuscany. She saw it, and it was fine for the London-based columnists. And it was interesting on lots of levels. As ever with these debates, it confirms my instinctive wariness of them as a form. But it was also interesting seeing these two figures, Alistair Darling and Alex Salmond. Alistair Darling, particularly, because I think the general consensus, I've spoken to a lot of people about this, is that he won. By the way, one of the many flaws of these debates is there has to be a winner. And it was interesting seeing Alistair so, at times, animated and on the edge of history. He's leading this historic campaign. Sorry, for those outside the UK, Alistair Darling is leading the campaign to stay in the UK. It's called the Better Together campaign. And what is interesting, watching Alistair, is thinking about his extraordinary career. Again, outside the UK, he's now based in Edinburgh, but he's a Westminster MP. And when he was in the Labour government based in Westminster, he had the reputation of being incredibly dull. He would kill off any issue that he was put in charge of. I remember when he was made for about 10 minutes Transport Secretary at Westminster. And I had this coffee with Gordon Brown about other things. And this was when Gordon adored Alistair. That is no longer the case. In fact, far from it. And Gordon said to me, "Isn't Alistair doing well at Transport?" So what do you think Alistair says? Isn't he doing well at Transport? And I said, you know, it's interesting you mentioned that. I cannot think of a single word I've read or heard about transport since Alistair took over. And Gordon looked up and said, "Exactly." That's what he did. He just neutered every topic. And you know what it is with politicians? Politics is an art form. And you can sniff and feel what are going to happen to these politicians almost from the first time that you meet them. You can tell who the leaders are going to be, who the failures are going to be. And with Alistair, I would have assumed, and I think he would have assumed, that he would have had this steady cabinet career at Westminster and then a rather noble, peaceful retirement. But then he became Chancellor of the Exchequer and went through a kind of strange metamorphosis. When he got the job as Chancellor, Gordon Brown told him, actually, he said, "I want you to do this for 2 years, Alistair, you gradual, relaxed, keep everything calm, general election." And then Gordon was going to bring in the person who he really adores, Ed Balls. And Alistair was up for this, being this calm figure. But events changed him. And he was the one, you know, who would be sitting there in the Treasury and hearing that a bank was about to go bankrupt. As you know, the Royal Bank of Scotland, 10 seconds to bankruptcy. Events changed him. And he became this figure caught up in a great political and economic drama. Instead of being this relaxed figure who killed off every subject, each subject threatened to kill him off. I remember him telling me, that's the other thing, he never used to really speak to journalists, and suddenly we were all invited for dinner, and you know, they are wonderful hosts. And at one dinner, he told us, he was still Chancellor at the time, when Northern Rock nearly went bust, which was the most nerve-wracking thing for Alistair. You know, he'd had this calm life, kills off transport, kills off social security. Northern Rock nearly goes bust, and he's Chancellor. He'd only been Chancellor for about 10 minutes. And Alistair said to us at this dinner that he hardly got any rest, but got one weekend away during the Northern Rock crisis. And he said to his wife, Maggie, on the Sunday lunchtime, I'm just going to watch the football and switch off for an hour and a half. And he put on Sky Sports, and Newcastle United were playing, and they were sponsored by Northern Rock. And so even then, he couldn't relax. This cabinet minister who had been so relaxed. And now there he is in a debate on the edge of history. It's an extraordinary transformation where the end of the career is more dramatic and vibrant and unpredictable than the beginning and the middle and the near end. Most politicians you can really predict. You know, with George Osborne, he lives and breathes politics. He will be a candidate at the next Conservative leadership election. For those of you outside the UK, George Osborne is currently Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's only about 14. He's been on this diet, the 5-2 diet. I don't know if you know it outside the UK, where basically you don't eat for 2 days a week, and he's dyed his hair and brushed it forward. And he wakes up in the morning and thinks, I won't eat anything all day, but I will read every single political article and every interview. He lives and breathes it. And there will be no surprise in his career. He will be a candidate, and if you want my view, I think he will be the next leader of the Conservative Party. He's up against a comedian called Boris Johnson, but it's probably safer to be up against a comedian than another formidable political figure. He lives in Britain. Chuka Umunna, who Jim Doherty mentioned in his session, Labour shadow business secretary, lives and breathes it. Is so transparently ambitious. I can tell you exactly what's going to happen to Chuka. He's going to be a leadership candidate in the next Labour Party leadership campaign. He might win, but he's so young, things will go terribly wrong. You just know these things. But Alistair, you cannot work out what's going on from day today in this extraordinary. There are a few like it. I'll tell you another person who somebody had told me his career would work out as it did. I'd have said no. And that's the Speaker of the House of Commons at Westminster, a figure called John Bercow. For those of you outside the UK, the Speaker in the House of Commons chairs the debates and is a very powerful figure in the elected chamber. And John Bercow, small kind of figure, that's not his fault, but he just fact. When I first met John Bercow, just after the 1997 election, he was a Conservative MP, for those of you outside the United Kingdom. And he was so right-wing. He said to me, I interviewed him somewhere, and over coffee afterwards, I said to John Bercow, so who are you going to vote for in the leadership contest? The Conservatives had leadership contests then every 10 minutes. And he said to me, without any irony at all, I'm looking to vote for the nearest candidate to Enoch Powell. Now, Enoch Powell, for those of you who don't know, was a right-wing ideologue who had died by then. And that was Bercow's hero, this figure on the right. He was utterly, earnestly right-wing. Then, about 6 months later, I met Bercow for coffee, and he said, I'm campaigning for the government to increase aid to the third world. And I thought, this doesn't quite fit with the Bercow I met 6 months ago. Then I met him about a year later, and he said, Steve, I'm campaigning for gay marriage. And I thought, none of this fits. And then, after about 4 years, and Bercow became a moderniser in the Conservative Party long before David Cameron did. But when David Cameron became leader, he hates Bercow and didn't give him any job. So Bercow said to me, I got to know him quite well, still do. I've been speaking to him this very week. And Bercow said to me at one point, you know, I'm going to stand to be Speaker of the House of Commons. And I just said to him, forget it, you haven't got a hope. Piece of prophetic advice which shows how unreliable I am as a guide to British politics, because he won it and got it. And he is like, you know, sometimes in politics, in all your countries, people fit together and make sense, and you can make sense of them. I can't make sense of him, to be honest. On one level, as Speaker of the Commons, in the same way Alistair is complicated, his life has become complicated. I don't think he is. Bercow is complicated. As Speaker of the Commons, he has been, on some levels, absolutely radical and brave, holding the executive to account. The House of Commons, for those of you from America, you know, it's not as strong as Congress on many, many issues. But Bercow has given it more power, very bravely, because he knows Cameron hates him. And he's been admirable in some respects. But Cameron once said to me over a coffee, he hates Bercow. And he said, you know, Steve, one of the reasons why I find him so irritating is that I've noticed during Prime Minister's questions, do you know what I mean, those outside the UK by Prime Minister's questions? Anyway, it's a weekly event in the House of Commons, very theatrical. Cameron said to me, I've noticed during Prime Minister's questions, the peak viewing figure is at 8 minutes past 12 for Prime Minister's questions. And that bastard Bercow interrupts at 8 minutes past 12 every Wednesday. And I thought, Cameron must be making this up. This must be a sort of exaggeration. So the next time I went into the press gallery to watch Prime Minister's questions, I timed it and looked at it. 1 minute past, it starts at 12 o'clock, ends at 12:30. 2 minutes past 12, nothing from Bercow. 3 minutes, 4 minutes past, 5 minutes past, 6 minutes past, 7 minutes past. I thought, here we go. 10 seconds, nothing. 20 seconds. Then suddenly, Cameron speaking. The economic situation is booming, blah, 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 and order! 8 minutes past 12, on the dot, Bercow is standing up. Will the right honourable gentleman sit down, take some yoga lessons, take his pills, or leave now? The public hate us showing off during Prime Minister's questions. And there he is, showing off, preposterously, like a pantomime dame. I don't understand him. I'm a defender, but I don't understand him. And this happens sometimes in politics. You don't quite understand them. And Alistair's career doesn't make sense. The opposite is the case, I think, with Alex Salmond's career makes total sense. You see him also on the 5-2 diet, looking suddenly slim and elegant. And I think he looks quite like George Osborne. It's a very unnerving thought. But you know and you feel that he lives and breathes politics and that he would be in the game. It was very interesting for me watching Blair and New Labour introduce the Scottish Parliament, because Blair said to me, it was about 97, 98, he said, look, I'm not really interested in this devolution stuff, but at least it'll kill off Alex Salmond. And Blair, who, you know, for all his faults, was then quite a sharp reader of the rhythms of politics, hadn't bothered looking at Salmond, because you just have to look at him, and he lives and breathes it. It was not going to kill him off, because he's not the type to be killed off. And yet, oddly, and this quite often happens to people, as they reach a great climactic in their lives and career, instead of sort of rising to a new level, I thought on that debate he looked tired, actually. When he gave a speech in London, I thought he looked very tired and almost overwhelmed by it, as can often happen, that sort of history almost, as it reaches them, they pass it by. We'll have to see. But for sure, he was never going to be undermined by devolution. We'll see what happens next month. And next month, obviously, is going to be a moment of great excitement for all of you who are from Scotland. The Jonathan Dimbleby 1/50th of the audience here today. And yet, on another level, this is why I'm going to talk a bit about referendums, if that's okay with you. I wonder how much will change. I wonder how much will change by that debate. I wonder how much will change by the referendum. And there are two reasons I pose that question. One is about our weird relationship with referendums. It was very interesting for me, looking back, I must have written so many columns and done so many what we call two-ways in broadcasting about referendum campaigns in Britain. Most have never been held. You know, we were going to have a referendum on the euro, whether we should be in part of the euro. We were going to have a referendum on electoral reform in Blair's first term, never held. And when we do hold them, they don't change very much. We've held one in the United Kingdom in 1975 about Europe. And I hasten to add, I was only very, very young at the time. But I can remember the drama being like it is here in Scotland at the moment, and this great sense of history reaching a decisive, defining point. And the Prime Minister at the time, Harold Wilson, a Labour Prime Minister, actually said, and I think it's in the legislation, this referendum, he had a silly voice for those of you who don't know who he was, this referendum will be legally binding on all future parliaments. The 1975 referendum. Huge debate, former prime ministers, everyone was doing it, like in Scotland now. And there was a huge majority in favour of staying in Europe. And Wilson, once it was over, said to his people, thank God we've killed this bloody issue. It's destroying me, but we've killed it. It's over. It's over. Within 6 months, the main cabinet minister who had been calling for a referendum to pull out of Europe, someone called Tony Benn, was out and about saying, it's absolutely clear that Britain must pull out of Europe. And Harold Wilson had a kind of, he basically retired from politics and was never seen again. And sure enough, within 5 years, the Labour Party was committed to pulling out of the European Union without a referendum. It didn't kill the subject for a second. Far from it. So Labour then was committed to pulling out of Europe, and as we all know, the Conservatives now, they've swapped positions, and the Conservatives have been basically having a nervous breakdown over Europe for the last 20 years. It's brought down their last 3 leaders and possibly the current one. It didn't solve anything. So here's why it might not solve very much in Scotland. Maybe there are other deeper things going on. In 1997, Blair was not only saying, well, at least it'll kill off salmon. The other thing Blair was absolutely clear about when setting up the Scottish Parliament, he said to his mate Derry Irvine, look, let's keep it minimal, right? What's the least power we can give them? Well, look, give them health, they've got that already, really. So they tried to create a parliament which they thought would be about the least they could get away with, if you know what I mean, in Edinburgh. However, that's the first shift. Kinnock warned them, the former Labour Party leader, that this would lead to all other kinds of things. So the Parliament was set up. The very powers which Blair thought would be the least interesting and minimal were the very policy areas that the Westminster Coalition in 2010 were obsessed about. Education, health, and so on. So here's the second thing that's happened. England has moved away from you. It's very interesting with the Conservative wing of this coalition at Westminster. You've got this sort of emollient figure, Cameron, as the very effective front person. I love Harold Macmillan and Disraeli and all the rest of it. But behind the scenes, it's being driven by people quite openly of the radical right. Quite nice people. Oliver Letwin is behind the scenes pulling everything. And he says to me, oh, Steve, he's a really nice bloke, Oliver Letwin, but he's a dangerous fanatic. And he says, Steve, what we're doing, I keep on reading that we're constrained by the liberal. We've achieved virtually everything we wanted to do. And we're reheating Thatcherism, Steve. It's marvellous, marvellous. And Michael Gove is there now, hidden behind the scenes, because he's dangerous up front. But the areas that obsess them are exactly the areas where Scotland got its own autonomy. They're obsessed with reframing the state. They're not interested in old traditional Tory issues about crime, and to some extent, the top aren't that bothered by Europe, actually. It's the rest of the party that are obsessed. They want to recalibrate the state. And I find when I do this show at the Edinburgh Festival, normally, I have to completely rejig it if it's a Scottish audience, because most of the issues I'll talk about in London don't affect you. So that's the second thing, that in a way is deeper than the referendum. And the third is that each of the main parties promised in some form or another greater power for Scotland, whatever happens next month. So it's going one way, it seems to me, and it's going towards Scotland one way or another. And that the referendum, whilst I say both being historic and dramatic, is a kind of punctuation mark along a way that's happening already. I'm not saying it's going to lead to formal independence, or should, but that's the kind of way it's going. Now, if it's okay with all of you, I want you to get in the minds of one of the politicians I've just mentioned. I'd like you, please, and forgive me, those of you who don't live here and don't know much about him or anything, you'll just have to be quiet for a second. Could you get in the mind, please, especially the Scottish people here, but also the English, of Alistair Darling? And I'm going to present you with a dilemma for Alistair. Is that all right? Just for a second. Last summer, I asked you to get in the minds of Nick Clegg, and people walked out. So, this is safer. Okay. Very briefly, you are all Alistair Darling. And here is your dilemma. It's a sort of personal dilemma, but deeply political as well. Certainly at Westminster at the moment, I don't know, you'll know much more about Scottish media. He is getting very positive reviews. And the columnists at Westminster are saying, he's got to come back. It's just what the Labour Party needs. The gravitas of a senior figure. History is calling for Alistair Darling once again. So, if you are Alistair, what do you do? Do you answer another call from history, having dealt with the banks in the midst of an apocalyptic global historic crisis, then led this Better Together campaign, in theory anyway? I don't know whether he has or not. You'll all know more about it than me. Or do you think, I'm going to bypass history this time? If Ed Miliband phones and says, so would you like to become Shadow Chancellor? I mean, I've got a difficult call to make with the current Shadow Chancellor if you say yes, or would you say, if you're Alistair Darling, enough? Do not return to the fray. To go back in politics, whether it's in Britain, America, wherever, Ukraine, wherever you all are from, it never works. It's like Bruce Forsyth coming to present the Generation Game for the third time. It would be embarrassing. What do you do? Alistair Darling's we're very short time, so which of you, Alistair Darlings, opt to come back to Westminster to play a major role in the build-up to the general election and possibly the next Labour government? Who said never? Right, we'll get the explanation for that. So would somebody who says yes to coming back, would you mind explaining why? Yeah.
Churchill had several disasters on his way to his great apotheosis. Churchill had several disasters on his way to his great apotheosis, and he then came back and carried on and ended his political career in a kind of failure. I don't think Alistair Darling is going to think very differently. I think if you're a politician, the main chance is, will you ever sleep at night thinking that you could have gone back, been Chancellor of the Exchequer, and then Prime Minister?
Interesting.
Lots of second lives in British politics, surely.
I don't know. I know I've said that he's gone through a metamorphosis. I didn't quite realise he'd become Churchill, but maybe that's where it's heading, that he's going to become a Churchillian figure. I can't see it, but I couldn't see Bercow becoming this left-wing speaker or whatever. So you might be right that he's in a Churchillian way coming back to save Britain and might be tempted to do it. Who shouted out never? Yes.
I've known Alistair Darling for about 30-odd years.
Right.
And he has never, ever, at any time, looked comfortable being in politics. He's done it as a duty, and he's been willing to do it as a duty. He's never become... And if I was him, or if he asked me, I would say, the end is now.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I agree with your instinct that he won't, having known him for not quite so long. But I don't think he will. But who knows? I think he has said he will wake up the day after and decide. If he follows your view, what job do you think he should get in Westminster? Yeah.
Well, he should. There's only really Chancellor of the Exchequer, possibly at this time Foreign Minister, but.
Right. So if he
but
became
he has
shadow,
to be heading towards.
if he became Shadow Chancellor, right? You're Ed Miliband. What do you say when you phone up Ed Balls, the current Shadow Chancellor? For those of you elsewhere, you know.
I would text him.
You would what? I would text it. I think you're onto something there. When I did this at the Edinburgh Festival, and it was a different dilemma, it was whether Miliband should sack Balls. Somebody said, yeah, and I said, well, which job would you give him? And this person said, Shadow Northern Ireland, which I don't think would necessarily, if the theme of this weekend has been mediation, I think it would need mediation, big time. Okay, now, we're going to have to move on to the British general election because we're running out of time. Has anyone got anything they'd like to, you've had the kind of referendum debate, but is there anything you would like to raise before we quickly look ahead to something which affects more people in this room directly and that we will have a vote, the British general election? Anything though on the referendum, Scotland? Does anyone, some people told me in Edinburgh they profoundly disagree with me that this thing next month will be utterly decisive and somehow cathartic. And do any of you think that, or do you broadly agree with me?
If we both know nothing will change, nothing will happen,
Yeah.
forget about it. Things will only change if we get a yes vote.
Right. So no, basically, things just carry on.
Yeah.
You don't think there will be another call for a referendum very quickly, as there was?
No, there'll be another one in generations.
What do you mean by generation? How many?
25, 30.
Oh, really? As long as that? Sorry. Yeah. If it's quite narrow. Yeah. I think if it's close, I tend to agree with you, but you know. Yeah.
It really does look like it's going to, everybody around here thinks it's no, but up in Perthshire, really, it's much, much closer.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I've worked in long small countries which have been run by parties with West African in the title. I've never seen one improved by it.
Yeah.
It's extremely worrying.
Yeah, it is. If it's close, I suspect the debate will continue about a second after the polls close. But we'll see. Yeah, just very quickly.
One proviso for that, this happened in Quebec, and they instantly thought one more push and we'll be in. They were punished for making everyone go through another referendum again.
Right.
It's painful. It's about divorce. It's about a lot of emotional things as well as practical.
I can see that. Yeah.
Going through this again. I'm persuading someone in 5 years to go through this again. I think it might be a severe punishment for
Oh, really? Right. So you tend to agree it's going to be another generation before it comes back. Well, I was going to say we'll soon find out. We won't if it's another generation. It will take 25 years, but we'll. It's very interesting. Yeah. Sorry. Just.
If the UK did vote to leave the EU, and it was clear that Scotland had voted completely the other way from England,
That will trigger it. Yeah. So, and that could happen in 2017. So it could happen again quite quickly. Okay, now, talking of 2017, that will only happen if the Conservatives win the next election. So let's, briefly, for the time left with us, look ahead to the British general election. If you don't mind me asking again, I won't ask you who you're going to vote for, but your prediction, please. Who thinks the Conservatives, this is now the Westminster 2015 general election, who thinks the Conservatives will win an overall majority in this room? Prediction? Right. Jonathan Dill, with vast majority are predicting an overall Conservative majority. Hardly anyone. That's when I've done this elsewhere, it's a bit more than that. Not that much more, but a bit more. That's interesting. Hardly any of you think that will be the case. How many of you think there will be a Labour overall majority? Small perhaps, but an overall majority. About the same as before. And how many think there will be a hung parliament in Westminster? Tiny minority of you think, no, the vast majority again. See, this is really, thank you. This is really interesting. I agree with you. I think it's the most likely outcome. And isn't it interesting? Because you're used to this in Edinburgh, but in the Westminster Parliament, this hardly ever happens. And now we've had one, and now we're anticipating another. And it's really interesting being at Westminster at the moment as a journalist, because you're in this weird experience where all the three parties think they're going to do terribly. Now, that cannot be the case. Someone's got to win this thing. But they are all in a state of fear. And it was captured for me. I was having coffee just after the European and local elections with a very senior shadow cabinet member, previously very loyal to Ed Miliband. And this shadow cabinet person was saying, it's a disaster. It's a disaster for Labour. You know, it's too late. Whatever Ed does now, it's too late. This was before Ed's bacon sandwich crisis. Well, it was after the bacon sandwich crisis, but before the bacon sandwich speech. But he said it was terrible. And as he was speaking, like a sort of funereal figure, a very senior Conservative joined us at the table briefly and just said to this shadow cabinet guy, "Congratulations, you're going to win the election. We're completely buggered." And I was sitting there thinking, I can't, how can I go through this? And so they all think they're going to lose. And an aide of Nick Clegg's told me after the European and local elections, he said, "We knew things were going to be really bad." These took place in May/June, for those of you outside the UK. And this is the third party who happens also to be in the coalition at Westminster. And for Nick Clegg, this advisor said, "We knew things were going to be really bad." And I said, "And did it turn out like that from your perspective?" He said it was much, much worse. So everyone is gloomy. Why? Why? Well, of course, there are lots of reasons. This is a really unpredictable election where no leader is fully in control. There are very wild external factors. We have a party here, for those of you outside the UK, called UKIP, led by a figure who is seemingly untouchable by the media. He's called Nigel Farage. Jim Doherty referred to him. And most leaders, if they had to experience what Farage experiences, would be destroyed. For example, he's got candidates who say we should kill everyone. He's got candidates, doing all kind of weird things. And whenever he's interviewed about it, Nigel Farage just says, "Oh, come on, Jim, I don't know who this candidate is. He's probably a nutter. We've all got him." And the media just says, "That's marvellous, Mr. Farage. Thank you very much." Gets away with it. Farage was asked about his last manifesto when he was leader of the UKIP party. And he said, "But Mr. Farage, in your last manifesto, you said that your main issue was that you were going to execute anyone who wasn't allowed to smoke in a pub or something." And Farage said, "Yeah, what a load of nonsense, Jim. What a load of nonsense." So it was complete rubbish. He was leader of the party at the time, but he is untouchable. So there are people like that around who frighten the orthodox leaders who would have to resign if they were in a similar situation. But there's another reason too. And that's we've got these very young leaders who are still trying to find out who they are. If you look at Cameron, he hasn't really decided because he got to power as a leader far too early. Salmond, you see, is different in that respect. Cameron doesn't really know if he wants to be a One Nation Macmillan type Conservative or Tony Blair, who he started off almost imitating. Blair said to me once, he's just imitating me. It's like watching Mike Yarwood imitate. Or now, with this right-wing UKIP party, whether he wants to be a sort of Margaret Thatcher-like figure. And as a result, they are all over the place. There was the kind of trivial examples highlighted. Some of you will have clocked that earlier this summer, at a Conservative Party fundraising dinner, Cameron and Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London, for those of you outside the United Kingdom, his main rival, offered to take part in a tennis match with whoever paid more money into the Conservative Party for this tennis match. And before the fundraising dinner, the whole Russia-Ukraine thing was happening. And Cameron, quite often in these international crises, his instinct is to be like Tony Blair. Even though in opposition, he condemned elements of Iraq. So, of all the Western leaders, Cameron was the toughest on Putin. What would Blair do? I'm going to be tough, so tough. He mocked France for its approach to Russia, so still selling weapons and all the rest of it. Anyway, he gave this statement, really tough on Putin. Went off to this fundraising dinner, really excited, because he thought the spin from the dinner would be, look how well Cameron is getting on with Boris. They're playing tennis together. So, this thing was bidded for, someone won, Cameron went back to number 10, and he said, right, get it out that Boris and I are playing tennis with someone, the sign that we're so close and working so close together. And one of Cameron's aides says, slight problem, Prime Minister. The person who won the bid to play tennis with you is the wife of a Russian oligarch who used to work with Putin. At which point, Cameron didn't know what to do. Who am I now? Am I this kind of Boris mediator? Am I this tough on Putin? And Boris came out, we're playing with a Russian geezer, maybe it'll go ahead, maybe it won't, maybe it will. good, good, good. And Boris Johnson can get away with it like Nigel Farage. Quite often he speaks Latin, if you've noticed, when he's in trouble. So, Mr. Johnson, are you playing with a Russian oligarch who is close to Putin? Dolce, decorum-esque, where are we? Jolly good, nice to see you, goodbye. He can get away with it, but Cameron can't, because he doesn't quite know who he is. It was made most vivid to me, we've got to stop shortly, but it was made most vivid to me when earlier in this parliament, their biggest crisis, I think, was over Cornish pasties. Now, what happened was this. You've got to remember that, unlike Harold Macmillan and so on, Cameron and George Osborne don't want to admit they are posh. They think they cannot be who they are. It's not their fault, they are. But they think they cannot be who they are. Now, in a budget a couple of years ago, George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, announced he billed it as a historic budget, tax reforming budget. He went to the House of Commons and he said, this budget will show, he was 5'2" diet, jet black hair, this budget will show that Britain is open for business. It will be a historic tax reforming budget. And I looked up at the sort of House of Lords gallery. I saw Nigel Lawson, a distinguished former Chancellor there, very excited. He dyed his hair for the occasion. The journalists waiting to take notes as to what this historic tax reform will be. And Osborne looked up and said, I plan to put a penny on Cornish pasties. What? Is that it? Anyway, that was his proposal. And all hell broke loose. In Cornwall, they all went around saying, I bet those posh bastards have never eaten a Cornish pasty in their bloody lives. And they probably hadn't. But the symbolism of admitting that was impossible in the way they wanted to project themselves. The Labour Party leapt on this issue really excitedly. Ed Miliband and Ed Balls, leader and shadow chancellor, were filmed in Greggs. For those of you who don't know what Greggs is, it's a sort of dodgy pasty place. Ed Miliband looked deeply uncomfortable, as if he had never been in a Greggs in his life. I can't think why. Ed Balls looked totally relaxed and ate 2 Cornish pasties on the spot. Anyway, they were in a state about how to deal with this. Osborne dealt with it by disappearing from the media, which you can do as a Chancellor. As a Prime Minister, you can't. Cameron had the next public appearance when this Cornish pasty thing was raging, was a joint press conference with the Italian Prime Minister over the Euro crisis. And they had met all day in number 10. And then the two of them walked out onto the podiums in number 10 for the press conference. Cameron spoke for 5 minutes about the Euro crisis, the Italian Prime Minister, 5 minutes on the Euro crisis. And then Cameron, who sort of does a Blair-like performance at press conferences, said, right, questions from the British press first. Nick Robinson, BBC. Prime Minister, have you ever eaten a Cornish pasty? Well, the first thing that happened is the Italian Prime Minister had a complete heart attack. So he didn't know what one was, and he was trying to, the translator, should I have eaten one? Do they sell? And Cameron, some of you might remember this, Cameron said, well, what a question, what a question. But since you've asked, I will tell you the answer. By the way, we're not taxing Cornish pasties because we don't like Cornish pasties, we do. It's to clear up Labour's mess. But since you asked, I thoroughly enjoyed a Cornish pasty at Leeds railway station recently. It was an absolute delight. The press conference continued, you know, Euro, Cornish pasty, Euro. Cameron went back to his office in number 10, where he sits on a sofa, curiously like Blair did, with a neat white iron shirt and young people around him saying how marvellous he is. And Cameron looked up at his advisor and said, thank God we've killed that one, the Cornish pasty question. And then he looked up at Sky News, the great tyranny for leaders of today, rolling news haunting them second by second. And there was Adam Bolton, the political editor of Sky News, outside at Westminster. And underneath it said, breaking news. A spokesman for Leeds railway station has said their Cornish pasty shop closed 10 years ago. Crisis in number 10, George Osborne ran through a secret tunnel. What do we do? What do we do? And the reason why they got into trouble was because these quite slick politicians, I mean, they understand politics, but they're trying to be who they're not. And the moment you do, it's really, really dangerous. And it's the same for Nick Clegg, who was in Parliament for one term, one parliamentary session, 5 years, before he became Deputy Prime Minister in a coalition. He had nothing to go back on to get a sense of what he was doing. And it's the same with Ed Miliband, who became leader of the Labour Party at a very young age. He's had a lot of experience, actually, and it makes him a very curious mix between someone who looks young and has lots of ideals, but was sort of brought up under the sort of Blair New Labour expediency. But he doesn't know what his public voice is. And so he's trying out voices. And it's inauthentic. When you see him live, Ed, rather like Cameron, he tries to be a bit like Blair. And he wanders around the stage. Blair used to do it. Kind of authentic kind of way. But Ed can't quite do it. So the last time I saw him, he was wandering around the stage in Birmingham. Neat white shirt. They all wear neat white shirts. And he said at one point, Ed, he said, I'll tell you what's wrong with this country. I'll tell you what's wrong with this country. It's got good people and bad government. He sort of wandered around. I want to achieve the reverse. You think, what? Bad people, good government. He is trying to be who he is not. He knows who he is deep down, but he doesn't dare yet be that person. And so that's one of the reasons why it's all so close and febrile, is we're dealing with very young people who aren't quite yet sure of their public voice. Now, we've got a few minutes. Does anyone want to raise something about the British general election? Yeah.
Okay, it's actually about Cornish pasties.
Oh, yeah.
There's a more complex issue going on here. Dave Cameron goes on holiday to a block.
Oh, yeah.
There is no way he's never eaten a Cornish pasty. It's what one has for lunch on holiday. But he can't admit it because he's on a posh holiday. Yeah, and that's the problem.
That's really interesting. Mike and I were talking about that very issue today. Holiday photographs are another example of how, and here I've got complete sympathy for them. A, they're not really allowed to go on holiday, which is terrible. They should be allowed to go. B, he can't be photographed in anything which suggests poshness. So, exactly, he could have said, I've had a Cornish pasty in Cornwall, and you would have thought that would have helped him enormously, but he didn't. Leeds railway station. Yeah. But that one might have closed as well. I think, to be honest, I think a Cornish pasty in Cornwall is the ace card to play. But you're right, it's because of where he goes, it will then be an issue. And I've got huge sympathy with them over this. I mean, they agonise about which jet to fly. You know, we can only go EasyJet if we go. You know, it's just the whole thing is a complete. We've got time for one more question. Over here, any point to raise before we break up? Yeah.
What effect do you think a yes vote in Scotland would have on the overall future of Westminster politics? And would it actually play to a kind of a radical right in the sense that it would be a lot easier for the Tories to win general elections in the future if Scotland actually wasn't involved in them, and they'd be able to push through referendum on Europe and such like in an easier way. So what effect do you think a yes vote would have on Westminster?
Yeah, it's a good question. Very briefly, because we are out of time and I know we've got to get out quickly. One, the immediate effect will be absolutely volcanic. I think it will be the biggest domestic political story since 1945. I think Cameron will seriously have to consider whether to resign or not as the Prime Minister who presided over the breakup against his wishes. I know he's denied that he would do this, but he's got to deny it in advance. I think he will consider it. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he had to go. Then, as you say, there is this issue about the Labour Party and representation lost in Scotland. That's harder to predict, I think, in the longer term, how England deals with that. But for sure, the 2015 general election, which will already be a dark election, a lot of issues about trust and integrity, and it will be made so dark and complicated by the fact that a lot of Scottish MPs were being elected, who would then disappear when the Scottish Parliament's ready as an independent Parliament. So it will be massive in the short and longer term. Absolutely huge story. I mean, journalistically, I hope you vote yes. You know, I won't say what my personal view is, but as a story, it will be quite mind-blowing. But I think on many ways destabilizing on lots of different fronts. But that's for another day. Just very quickly end by saying, one of the things, as I said earlier, politics is an art form. And we lack at the moment, and I mean this not in a pejorative way, we lack political artists at the moment. People who can communicate, who can hold an audience. And without that skill, a lot of politics is lost. And we haven't got great orators at the moment as we used to have. I think for those of you who were here last year, I reflected a bit on some of the great orators we used to have in British politics who aren't around now. But I will just end by saying, there is one great orator who I've seen, who some of you will have seen. And I'll just end with this. Bill Clinton, have any of you seen him live? You know what I mean? It's like watching a magician. I don't know how he does it. And Tony Blair, when he was very unpopular in the Labour Party after Iraq, at the Labour Party conference used to invite Clinton to speak. And Blair would say, right, I know you all hate me, so here's Bill Clinton. And the room would transform, the atmosphere. And Clinton had by then about 8 heart operations. And it was extraordinary. He didn't pull the usual levers that orators pull. He sort of spoke very softly. And he chose the most hard topic of global poverty. And at the end of every sentence, the audience went bonkers. If the West addresses global poverty, the West will benefit as much as Africa and those suffering from global poverty. Sweaty eruption of ecstasy in the room. And on it went. And after about the 8th standing ovation, global poverty, global poverty. I was standing near the back, next to the former health secretary, a very kind of bawdy figure. Health secretary for England, shows the difference. Frank Dobson. And at the 8th standing ovation, global poverty, we got to address, my friend Tony Blair, global. After about the 8th time, Frank Dobson came up to me and just said, Steve, this is the nearest I've experienced to group sex. And I thought, what a tribute to Clinton. And I just want to end by saying, actually, this whole festival, which is actually about pro-politics, it's partly about exploring crises when politics have broken down, when the politics isn't working, and looking at the way politics, through mediation and words and diplomacy, can return to these places. So it's a pro-politics festival in one respect. But anyway, the whole festival, but certainly the last hour, has been the nearest I've experienced to group sex, because you've been so brilliant. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
No more speeches for tonight, but Catherine and I would just love to thank you all for coming here. We cannot quite believe that for a second day, everyone stays for 6, 7, 8 hours and hears great orators, not just simply on politics, but art, wherever Peter Sachs is, peacemakers from around the world, those that have been involved in very tough conflicts. I mean, we've had the full breadth, I think, of sort of intellectual food and brain food to last us hopefully another year, but we really hope that you all come back next year. Who knows? We may be an independent country, we may be back in the UK, but whatever we are, I think we've managed to establish a genuine conversation here in the Scottish borders, and we are very, very proud, not only of our staff. I won't thank them individually now, but you know who they are. They have been absolutely brilliant in producing this festival, may I say at very little cost, but also to all of you, because actually this festival could not work without our international participants, the people from the Scottish borders, and everyone who wishes our well, including our funders. So thank you very much, and see you next week, next year.